The kid with the $15,000 bolt gun lowered his eye from the scope and shook his head the way a man shakes his head when he has already decided the answer before he checked the question. 600 meters with iron sights, he said, loud enough for the whole line to hear, loud enough for the camera on his tripod to catch it clean. In this wind, no rangefinder, no solver, no glass. He laughed once, short and flat. That's not marksmanship, that's mythology. Nobody shoots iron sights at 600 anymore because nobody needs to, and anybody who tells you different is selling you something. The crowd around him, 7, maybe 8 shooters, a couple of range regulars, one man with a camera of his own, murmured in the way crowds murmur when they agree with the loudest voice in the room because it is easier than disagreeing. If you've ever stood next to a man and had no idea you were standing next to the most dangerous shooter in the county, do me a favor right now and type iron sights in the comments, because the quiet old man at the back of that firing line, the one nobody had looked at twice since he arrived, was about to change every assumption on that range. He was standing apart from the group, back near the covered bench at position 12, holding a cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and he was watching the young man the way a man watches weather. Not with judgment, just with patience, just with the particular stillness of someone who has already been through the storm that is coming. His name was Ray Casper, and the last time he had fired a rifle at a target 600 meters away, it had been in a country that looked nothing like this one. In a year, most people on that range had not yet been born, and the target had not been steel. Ray Casper was 71 years old, and he was the kind of thin that a man gets when he has spent decades carrying nothing he did not need. His hair was white and cropped close under a plain brown cap. His hands, wrapped around the cold coffee cup, were the kind of hands you stop noticing until you notice them. The knuckles a little enlarged, the skin a little weathered, moving always with a deliberate economy that was not slowness, but something closer to its opposite. He had driven 2 hours that morning from the small house in the hill country where he had lived alone for 14 months. The house had been his and Margaret's for 31 years, and it was a good house, solid and quiet, and the quiet had been fine when Margaret was in it. And since she was not, the quiet had become something else entirely. He had not gone to the range to shoot. He had gone because the smell of hot snow, 9 and cold morning air, and the particular metallic sound of bolt-action cycling was the last smell and the last sound that still felt like the world he used to know, and sometimes that was enough reason. He carried in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket a small brass spirit level, no longer than his thumb, with an engraving on the flat of it in letters small enough that you had to hold it close to read them. Margaret had given it to him 11 days before her stroke in the kitchen of the house in the hill country, pressing it into his hand with both of hers and saying, with the small smile she used when she was being serious without wanting to look serious, "So you always stay level, Ray." He had not known it would be the last gift she ever gave him. She had not known it either. That was the part that got him. Some mornings, not the loss, which was enormous and permanent, but the ordinary way it had happened. The complete absence of ceremony, just a woman handing her husband a small brass thing in a kitchen on a Tuesday, neither of them understanding that the kitchen would never be exactly that again. He kept it in his breast pocket because it was the closest place to his chest that was not his chest. The young man's name was Colt Briggs, and he was, by any honest measure, a very good shooter. 25 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of confident posture that photographs well and reads as authority to people who cannot tell the difference between authority and performance. He had competed in precision rifle series for 4 years, had a podcast with 60,000 listeners, and had recently signed with a small optics company whose name appeared in white letters on his Black Range bag. His rifle was a custom-built 6.5 Creedmoor in a carbon fiber chassis, topped with a 34mm first focal plane scope that cost more than most people's first cars. It was a genuinely impressive piece of equipment, and Colt Briggs knew how to use it, which was most of his problem and all of his blind spot, because a man who knows how to use one thing very well sometimes forgets that the thing and the skill are not the same thing. He had been working the 600-meter line for the better part of an hour. grouping well the kind of consistent sub-MOA work that earned the nods he was getting from the shooters around him. And then someone, one of the range regulars, an older man in a green vest, had mentioned offhand that this range used to be run by a man who shot iron sights at distance and had never missed a cold bore shot in 20 years of coming here. And Colt Briggs had done what Colt Briggs did with information that challenged the edges of his understanding, which was to dismiss it loudly and on camera. 600 meters with iron sights, he said again to no one and everyone. I will put $50 on the line right now. $50 to any shooter on this range who can put a cold bore hit on the 600 plate with no optic, no spotter, no solver. Because I have been shooting this discipline for 4 years, and I am telling you, as a matter of physics and ballistics, it cannot be done consistently. It cannot be done reliably. And anyone who says it can is romanticizing a past that the data does not support. He pulled out his phone and propped it against his range bag, pointed at the line. Ray Casper at the back of the range set his cold coffee cup down on the bench behind him. He did not do it because of the $50. He did not do it because he wanted to correct the young man, particularly. He did not even do it entirely because the young man had used the word impossible, though that word had landed in a specific place inside him, the way that word had been landing in a specific place inside him since 1971 when a captain had used it in front of his team in the Keesun Valley, and Ray had decided quietly and without ceremony to find out for himself. He did it because he heard Margaret's voice clearly and without drama in the back of his mind, the way he had been hearing it for 14 months in doorways and at kitchen tables and on the long drives down empty roads. Margaret's voice said simply and in the tone she used when she was not asking, "Ray, go shoot." So he went to his truck. What Ray Casper lifted from the padded case in the bed of his pickup was not much to look at. It was a Moan C. Garand. Not original issue, but close, with a standard military rear aperture sight and a front post that Ray had replaced himself in 1987 with a slightly thinner blade that he had spent 3 weekends filing to the exact dimension he wanted. The stock was walnut, worn smooth in the places a man's hands go when he has held a rifle the same way for 50 years. There was no scope rail. There was no provision for a scope rail. The rifle had been built to be used exactly as it was, and Ray had used it exactly as it was, on paper and steel, and once upon a time, on things that were neither. He walked back to the firing line, carrying the rifle loose in his right hand, muzzle down, the way a man carries a thing he has carried 10,000 times. Colt Briggs saw him coming, and because he was a young man with good instincts underneath the performance, felt something shift in the room before he understood why. He looked at the old man. He looked at the rifle. His expression moved through several things quickly: amusement, confusion, and then something quieter and less comfortable that he would not have been able to name if asked. "Sir," he said carefully, that's a Garand." "Yes," Ray said, "with iron sights, yes." Colt Briggs looked at the rifle. He looked at the old man's face, which was patient and unremarkable, and gave nothing away. He looked at his own camera on its tripod, pointing at the line. "You want to shoot the 600 plate," Colt said. It was not quite a question. "If nobody minds," Ray said, "I'll only need 1 shot." Colt stepped back from the bench. He made a gesture toward the line that was half courtesy and half theater because he had 60,000 listeners, and he understood instinctively that whatever happened next was going to be content. "By all means," he said, "line is yours." There was a man standing at the far end of the covered benches in a gray canvas shirt and boots that had seen serious use, who had been quiet since Ray Casper had first walked onto that range. He was 53 years old, square through the jaw, with the particular posture of a man who has spent decades being the calmest person in difficult rooms. His name was Dennis Holt. He had retired from the Marine Corps 4 years ago as a sergeant major after 28 years, the last 12 of which had been spent in roles he did not describe at civilian gatherings. Dennis Holt had not said anything since Ray arrived because he had been trying to decide if his eyes were telling him the truth. When Ray stepped up to the bench and settled the Garand into his shoulder, Not sitting, not using a rest, standing in a slightly open stance with the rifle pulled into the pocket of his shoulder with the ease of a man settling into a chair he has sat in 10,000 times. Dennis Holt stopped, trying to decide. He knew that stance. He had been taught that stance. He had been taught it in 1993 at a range in the California high desert that no longer appeared on any official training roster, by a quiet, lean staff sergeant named Ray Casper, who had told his class on the first morning, in a voice so flat and unhurried it took a moment to understand he was not joking, that a scope was a tool and a tool could be taken away, and that any shooter who could not operate at distance without his tools was not a shooter, but a technician. And that technicians had their place, but that place was not where his class was going. Dennis Holt stood very still at the end of the bench and did not make a sound, because he understood what was about to happen, and he knew better than to interrupt it. Ray stood at the line and looked downrange for a long moment. The 600-meter plate was a 4-inch circle of steel, painted white so you could see the impact smear. At 600 meters with the naked eye, it was a small, pale suggestion in the afternoon light. The wind was coming in from the left, gusting somewhere between 8 and 12 miles an hour. The kind of variable push that breaks into pulses if you are patient enough to feel them. Ray did not ask anyone for a wind reading. He noted them as he reached into his breast pocket and closed his fingers around the brass spirit level for a moment, not to use it, just to hold it. And then he placed it carefully on the bench beside him, where he could see it. He took 2 slow breaths. He felt the wind on the left side of his face and on the back of his left hand where it rested on the stock, and he waited, the way he had been waiting for things his entire adult life, without impatience, without the fidget that younger men call focus. The wind dropped for a moment, just a moment, the way it does between gusts. Ray fired. The Garand's report was sharp and clean in the cold air, and for a full second the range was completely silent, and then the plate rang. It was a small sound at 600 meters, a thin, bright clang carried back on the wind, and it was the most complete sound on that range in a very long time. The crowd did not react for almost 2 full seconds. They stood there with the sound settling into them the way a true thing settles, slowly, before the understanding arrives. Colt Briggs was looking through his spotting scope at the plate, where a faint gray smear sat just below center on 4 inches of steel. He straightened up from the scope very slowly. He did not say anything. He was not the kind of man who is often at a loss for words on a firing line, and he was at a loss for words. Ray lowered the Garand, exhaled once, and looked mildly downrange, the way a man looks when he has done a thing he has done before and has no particular need to discuss it. It was Dennis Holt who spoke first. He walked from the end of the bench toward the line slowly, because his right knee had been rebuilt twice and did not move quickly anymore, and because he wanted to give himself enough time to be certain his voice would be steady when he used it. When he reached a point about 10 feet from Ray, he stopped, and he looked at him the way Marines look at Marines, which is a specific look that does not require explanation among the people who share it. "Staff Sergeant Casper," Dennis Holt said, in a voice that was quiet but carried. I will be damned." Ray turned. He looked at Dennis for a moment, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, a small internal event that he kept mostly to himself. "Holt." There was a short silence between them that was not uncomfortable, and then Dennis turned to face the line. The shooters, Colt Briggs with his spotting scope still in his hand, the man with the camera, the range regulars in their green vests. And he said, "I'm going to tell you who this man is, because I think you should know." Ray looked at the ground. "Dennis, that's not necessary." Dennis held up one hand. "It is necessary. Because the young man with the Creedmoor just called something impossible that this man has been doing since before that young man was born, and I want the record to be accurate." He paused for a moment, and then he said, "My name is Dennis Holt. I retired from the Marine Corps 4 years ago as Sergeant Major after 28 years of service. In 1993, I attended a classified precision marksmanship course in the Mojave. The lead instructor of that course was the man standing in front of you, Staff Sergeant, later Master Sergeant, Raymond Casper, MC, retired. He taught us without scopes. He required us to qualify at 500 meters with iron sights before we were permitted to touch an optic. When I asked him why, he said that a tool can be taken away and that a skill cannot, and that we were there to learn the one that lasts. Dennis stopped. He looked at Colt Briggs directly for a moment. There are things in this man's service record that I will not discuss on a civilian range. There are distances in this man's record that the people in this room would argue about. What I will tell you is the one thing he told my class on the last day of instruction, because I have repeated it to every shooter I have trained in the 28 years since. He turned slightly, and he said it. A scope shows you the target. Iron sights teach you to find it yourself. One of those skills stays with you when everything else is taken away. Ray was looking at the ground with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He looked like a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere else, and he did not say a word, and the crowd on the line was completely quiet. What happened after, in the hour that followed, was the part of the story that Dennis Holt would tell his son about that same evening quietly over the phone, trying to explain why his voice sounded the way it sounded. Colt Briggs did not say anything for a long time after Dennis stopped talking. He stood with his spotting scope in his hand, and he looked at the plate downrange, and he looked at the old man, and he looked at the Garand leaning against the bench. And then he set the spotting scope down carefully on his range bag, and he walked around the end of the bench, and he stood in front of Ray Casper, and he said, in a voice that was smaller and more honest than anything he had said on a firing line in a long time, "Master Sergeant, sir, I was wrong. Though I said something was impossible because I couldn't do it, and I said it in front of a camera, and I'm sorry. I'd like to shake your hand if you'll let me." Ray took his hands out of his pockets. He looked at the young man for a moment with the gray, steady eyes that Margaret had once said looked like river bottom stones, flat and clear and very still. And then he took Colt's hand and shook it once, and he said, "I called something impossible in front of my team in 1971. My captain made me try it again. I hit it the second time. He said, 'Casper, you're going to be all right, but only because you already know when you're wrong.' I've been trying to deserve that sentence for 50 years, so will you. That's not a problem. That's just the work." Colt nodded. He did not trust his voice entirely. Ray looked at him for another moment, and then he reached over to the bench and picked up the brass spirit level, and he held it out to Colt in his open hand. Colt looked at it. It was small and worn, and the brass was the color of old honey. He took it carefully. The way you take a thing when you understand it is not simply a thing. He turned it over. He read the engraving. He read it again. He looked up at Ray. Ray had already picked up the Garand and was turning toward the parking lot. "Keep it level," Ray said, without turning around. And then he walked across the gravel toward his truck. And nobody on that firing line said a word until the sound of his engine had faded out past the tree line. Ray drove home through the hill country in the early afternoon on 2-lane roads that wound between cedar and live oak, turning color in the October cool. He did not think about the shot. He had made that shot or one very like it more times than he could count. And it had never been the point. He thought about the young man's face when he read the engraving. He thought about Dennis Holt's voice going steady with effort. He thought, most of all, about Margaret, the way he thought about Margaret on every drive now, in the particular conversation he had been having with her since November of the previous year, that she could not answer, but that he held up his end of anyway. "I went to the range today," he told her, "watching a hawk ride a thermal over the ridge to the east. I gave away your spirit level. I hope that was all right." He felt, not for the first time, that she would have said it was more than all right. That she would have said in her quiet way that a thing like that was meant to travel. He pulled into his driveway as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and he sat in the truck for a moment before he got out. The way he always did now, giving his knee time and giving himself time. The house was lit gold by the late light. The porch she had painted blue the summer of 2014 was the same blue it had always been. He got out of the truck and stood in the driveway and said, out loud to the air and the cedar and whatever else was listening, "Good afternoon, sweetheart." I stayed level. Then he went inside. The silence in the house that evening did not feel smaller. But it felt, in some way he could not have explained and did not try to, like it had been joined by something. Not filled, just accompanied. Colt Briggs removed the scope from his rifle the following Saturday morning. He did not tell anyone he was doing it. He did not post about it. He drove to a private range outside of town and he set up at 200 meters with iron sights, and he missed his first 11 shots and hit his 12th, and he sat with that for a while. Over the following months, he worked his way out to 400 meters. He never reached 600. He did not expect to, not yet, maybe not for years. But somewhere around the 300-meter mark, on a cold morning in January with a wind coming off the hill that he was starting, just barely, to read by the feel of it on his face, he understood something that he had not been able to understand before and that he could not have explained in a podcast because it was not the kind of thing that travels well in words. He stopped saying impossible on his show. Not as a policy, just because the word had started to feel, when it formed in his mouth, like something that belonged to a smaller version of himself. His audience grew. He did not think that was unrelated. The brass spirit level sat on the shelf above his loading bench where he could read the engraving from his seat. He did not move it. He did not show it in videos. Some things are not content. Some things are just true. There is a lesson in this story that is not about marksmanship, and it is not about equipment, and it is not even entirely about humility, though humility is part of it. The lesson is simpler and older than any of those things. The world is full of men who are walking around with skills that the rest of us cannot measure because the instruments we use to measure have only been around for 20 years, and some of those men have been practicing for 50. They do not announce themselves. They do not correct you when you are wrong. They wait, and they watch, and sometimes, on a cool October morning at a range in the hill country, when the wind drops for a moment between gusts, they show you what the word possible actually means. If this story reached something in you, if it made you think of the quiet men in your own life who carried more than they ever showed, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe, so more stories like this one find their way to you when you need them. And leave iron sights in the comments below. For every quiet man who never needed a scope to find what he was looking for, they are still out there, and every so often, one of them steps up to a line and fires once and walks away, and the sound of it is still ringing.